basic market data to make a point, and then we'll close, and then one of our local partners here in Singapore will wrap up with some thoughts. So, I think all of you have seen this chart. This is the reality that we live in today, which is we need massive emission reduction or removals if we're going to keep 1.5 real. And it's big and it's not, right? So we have to cut emissions by almost 50% in the next 10 years. Cut emissions, right? Not avoid them, cut them, reduce them. And that's where there's a basic disconnect between much of what's going on in voluntary space and what the Paris Agreement is designed to achieve. So it's after the speed and the scale that science requires. You've probably all seen this as well, but it's always important for framing. Half a degree matters. Why do we care about 1.5 if you're a small island state or a poor country versus 2 degrees? The fact of the matter is that the impacts almost double with half a degree. And then imagine them more than doubling with another half a degree at 2.5. Right? It's not a direct correlation, it's a multiplier. So whether it's rainfall, whether it's droughts, whether it's impact on economy, particularly on the poor countries, the impacts double with half a degree. And that's why it's so important that if you're interested in climate and you want to be a contributor to a solution, you're thinking the way the Earth is thinking, which is we need real emission reductions with speed and scale now. So I mentioned this yesterday talking from my notes, which isn't always as effective and efficient as it could be, because my phone can fall in asleep. But let me run you through this, because this is what the Paris Agreement says. So keep in mind, Fede and I have been negotiating under the Paris Agreement, under the UNFCCC since 2004. So when we talk about what the Paris Agreement says or doesn't say, it's because we've been in the rooms, we know what the words say, and we know what was intended, and not only that, we know what's happening. There's a lot of misinformation because people read a treaty text and think they understand what that means. They weren't in the room. They don't understand that a lot of people are in the room knowing exactly what they want to achieve, and then they fight over words for 3 days just to try to make someone in the room happy. But the basic point is understood, and everybody understands that was there, what was intended, and then the UNFC Secretariat, which helps implement, knows exactly what was meant. And often there's a disconnect between the word selection, I'll use one called assessment versus verification, right? Under the Paris Agreement, there is an MRV, Measurement, Reporting, and Verification process. Article 5 does an assessment, which is part of that verification process. Now, someone will come and say you're doing an assessment, it's not a verification. Sorry. These are just different word choices chosen in different rooms on different days that actually make no difference. It's just semantics. The actual process is the process, no matter which word you choose. Right? But these are some of the things that you have to understand as you unwind this. So, point number 1, it needs to be part of an NDC. Why is that important? Right? This is a sovereign which has to make a commitment to emission reductions. Now, there are some exceptions that I just want to touch on. I'm going to use Burundi as an example. We were looking at their NDC yesterday, and they have about 9 million tons of emissions today, and they're projecting that they're going to have 38 million in the next 10 years. Right? That actually doesn't get us where we need to go. But this is one of the nuances of the Paris Agreement that least developed countries and small island states have a bit of flexibility. Unfortunately, Burundi took advantage of that flexibility. But here's the point. Over the next 5 years, they have to update their NDC, and you can go with an upward trajectory, then you gotta go flat, and then you gotta go down like your small island state. So that bending happens normally through the Paris Agreement. So don't get too caught up on a first NDC. The point is, all NDCs have to go from upward to flat to down, or if you're a rich country, you have to go immediately down, right? But this is about equity, NDCs and equity. So it's gotta be part of an NDC, because if it's not part of an NDC, it's not part of that bending the curve exercise. So if you're outside of an NDC, no one has assurances that you're contributing to bending that curve. Point number 2, national greenhouse gas inventory. We talked about this yesterday. Why is that important? The Paris Agreement and the Article 6.2 review will be measuring all actions against a national greenhouse gas inventory. So this is all the emissions and removals in your entire economy or sector. And you have to demonstrate by hard data in your national greenhouse gas inventory, which is independently reviewed, that your emissions are actually matching your goal in your NDC. So if your goal was to reduce emissions from 1 million to 800,000, your greenhouse gas inventory is the scorecard that is reviewed. So if your activity is not part of that greenhouse gas inventory, it gets kicked out under the Paris Agreement. It's not in. It needs to be part of that, and it needs to show, as based on the national inventory, that what you're doing contributes to bending that curve or wherever the NDC cycle is. So I'm going to actually look at what I put for the next one. What do we, actually, this is supposed to be a workshop, so I wanted to invite questions. Does anybody have any question on those first 2 points? Why is an NDC important? What is a national greenhouse gas inventory? Why does it matter? Any questions on that, or is that fair and straight? Okay, so all right, I'm gonna just keep flying. It's early morning and I didn't want to lose anything along the way. Authorization. 30 times in the decision text. Developing countries asked that that authorization was in there and required it 30 times. Why? There's an understanding that if a sovereign is responsible for a shift in its economy, that it has to control the asset that measures that transition, right? So if a sovereign is responsible now to change its economic development to a low emission trajectory, all of those carbon tons need to be within its power so that it can implement. Now, when an asset goes offshore, and the money is primarily kept offshore, that makes it more and more difficult for a country to implement NDC. And unfortunately, that's the voluntary market at this point. It's a standard set up offshore by a collection of foreign people that authorize foreigners to come into a developing country using their own foreign standard, create an asset class and take it offshore, liquidate it, and deliver some portion of the revenues back into a developing country. Now, most developing countries don't know that that's happening. So that's why this authorization is a requirement. So before an ITMO can be even qualified as an ITMO, it has to be authorized by the host government. The host government, through its process of authorization, will talk to the stakeholders about what the equitable revenue distribution is in order to implement that action. So authorization is critical going forward. The next issue that the Paris Agreement requires, again, put in by developing countries, that a carbon ton needs to be issued by the sovereign for it to be an ITMO. Right, so this is where the alternative standards, the alphabet soup of standards, fail again, in the sense that you can't have a standard issue credit. The sovereign has to issue. And again, this gets back to this point. As a sovereign, if I'm responsible under a treaty obligation to reduce my emissions, how is it I authorize and how is it that I issue carbon credits that are above and beyond my target? The sovereign is responsible for that. I'm implementing domestically, I've overachieved. I now am certifying for a global accounting system that I have overachieved and I'm going to export an asset. And I, as sovereign, am responsible for that, and I must issue that credit and be liable for it. That liability doesn't fall on the company, it doesn't fall on the individual. A sovereign has to take that obligation for its issuance. National registry. So the Paris Agreement allows three options. A country can create a national registry. It can join a group of countries that have a joint registry, or it can use a free one provided by the UNFCCC. So if you think about Europe, they will provide a national registry for all the countries that are in Europe. If you think about Canada, Canada has created its own national registry that will only cover Canada. As you think about developing countries, I think you're going to find groups of countries providing registries, primarily for the reason it's difficult to build a registry, maintain a registry to international banking requirements. Keep in mind, these are now sovereign assets. If Papua New Guinea has 100 million tons at $30, you're now talking real money that a sovereign is responsible for to now liquidate those assets and deploy that capital in its economy to achieve its NDC. If that capital is stolen, sort of disappears in some manner, the sovereign can execute. So now sovereigns are putting registries that are going to have a lot of other elements built in. There's probably going to be custody. There'll be official settlement mechanisms. How do you do complete transactions? So registries will be much more than just a registry going forward, but they will be either national, group of countries, or using the free registry. But this is critically important to avoid double counting. Adjusted. This is where a lot of people get confused with this notion of corresponding adjustments. The word corresponding adjustment is thrown around. People are like, well, I don't need a corresponding adjustment. We shouldn't use one because I don't think it applies, etc. The Paris Agreement doesn't give you that option. It basically says the following: a corresponding adjustment is a two-step process. Every exporting country has to adjust as step one. So if I am going to now take a credit outside of my NDC, and it just makes sense, right? So my NDC says I was going to reduce emissions by 1 million. I got 1.2 million, so I'm going to have 200,000. So now I'm taking those out of my accounting system, and I'm allowing them to be used elsewhere. So I have to adjust, right? So for the global accounting to correct, those 200,000 tons have to be taken out of my NDC and allowed to be either retired or put in someone else's NDC. So the first adjustment is critically important. And those 6 steps are going to be checked by the Article 6.2 review process. Is it in your NDC? Is your national greenhouse gas inventory showing an actual emission reduction or net removal? Did the country authorize this credit? Did it issue it? And has it adjusted? It's an obligation of every sovereign to present that information, and will be reviewed under 6.2. Now, 7 is an interesting issue that we were talking a little bit about yesterday. Methodologies. Can sovereigns use a voluntary methodology and try to achieve an ITMO? Or should they be using approved methodologies? I'll approach it this way. Article 6.2 is looking for consistency. So it has to make sure that if something is taken from one economy and transferred into another economy, it's the same thing. It's got to be apples to apples. It can't be apples to oranges. So if the host country is using one set of methodologies and the buying country or company is using a second set of methodologies, that gums up the system, slows the process. What is the equivalency between these two things? So it's asking for consistency. So the efficient model is that you're using consistent methodologies so that the entire system knows exactly what to do with the carbon ton. There's a lot being written primarily by AIDA and some of these other, the gold standard, that somehow Article 6 Vera is going to be pushed into Article 6.2 and everyone's going to be happy. I would tell you there's a lot more friction points in there. Right? If 90% of VERA is about avoidance, and at the end of that process you have to show an actual emission reduction, you run the risk of a whole series of credits going into a quote-unquote ITMO, and at the end they all get kicked out because they're not demonstrating any actual emission reduction. Let me use a case in point, and and we were compiling this data. If you look at the countries in Red Plus that have the most VERA projects, they have been the least effective in actually reducing emissions. The countries with the fewest VERA projects have been the most effective at actually reducing emissions. So, case in point, you look at Peru, 35 VERA projects. If you actually look at the data, emissions from deforestation are going up. You look at PNG, 2 VERA projects. You look at Indonesia, 4 VERA projects. Emissions have actually gone down by around 50%. Why is that? Okay. If a country like Peru and a government takes comfort and they say, well, we have a lot of people out there talking about Red Plus and implementing projects, etc. They then don't pull the other levers that they need to pull to actually reduce emissions. They think that it's been being handled by other people. When a government understands that it has to implement itself under its NDC and it has to pull all the levers it has itself, then you see it's actually achieving emission reductions because that's what's being measured. So it's Colombia, it's Peru. Fede will talk a little bit more about this. But there's a direct correlation between the sort of volume and activity of voluntary markets with the actual slowing of emission reductions, directly correlated. All right, I'm almost done. Corresponding adjustments, guys. Corresponding adjustments only apply to other sovereigns if they need that ITMO to help them achieve their NDC. Switzerland, case in point. Switzerland is not meeting its NDC. So it is trying to get ITMOs from a variety of countries so that it can add it to its NDC. So Switzerland, for lack of a better analogy, promised to get 1 million tons. In fact, their emissions are 1.2 million tons. They have to buy 200,000 ITMOs, or emission reductions, from someone else's account in order to be in balance. So not only does Switzerland have to buy those reductions, they now have to assure that emissions are actually going down in the country from where they bought the credits. And unfortunately, Switzerland hasn't done a good job at that. Most of the countries where they're buying credits, we know because we're looking at the data, aren't going to have an emission reduction at the end of it. So Switzerland is going to have to deal with a bunch of credits that the review process will kick out. So it's a very difficult game to buy emission reductions or ITMOs from a developing country if you don't have the analytics to understand that they're actually achieving that emission reduction for your corresponding adjustments. Now, does a company need a corresponding adjustment? The answer is no. So if a corporate buys an ITMO, it needs to ensure the first 6 points adjusted by the host country, but then it retires it. Actually, that's better for the atmosphere. If a corporation buys an adjusted credit and retires it and does not allow any other government to use it as a corresponding adjustment, that is better for the atmosphere because now the governments have to achieve the emission reductions themselves. So you want an adjustment, but not a corresponding adjustment for atmosphere to carry. Okay. We talked about this yesterday and I wanted to drill down a little bit more. And I'm going to sort of combine 9 and 10 together. So if you look at Article 6.4 text, paragraph 37 challenges Article 6.4 to operate at the highest scale possible. So even 6.4 is moving away from project activities measured in isolation. So case in point, should you be given credit for setting up one solar farm while you authorize 2 coal-fired plants in your energy sector? The Paris Agreement says no. The solar farm is doing great work, but the fact of the matter is we're too late for that. The solar farm only gets credit if some energy is taken off the grid somewhere else, so that the net goes down. That's where we are with the science now. So you've got to present, at the highest level, you've got to present an NDC that shows your emissions are going down sector-wide. So you only get an ITMO if the net emissions go down. You don't get it for just one solar farm. Second, credits don't last for 30 years or 40 years or whatever else it is currently in the voluntary markets. They have a 5+5, and then they disappear. So to a certain extent, it says they're an option to emit. And after 5 years, they disappear because now you have a new commitment period. The goals are reset, and credits and emission reductions are calculated again. Now, they've given, you can go back for approval, and we haven't agreed yet what the approval process is. You can get another 5-year renewal. If you can demonstrate that in the next commitment period, you are still reducing emissions based on a national greenhouse gas inventory. But then the notion is climate finance is scarce. It needs to be redeployed to new actions. So you get 5 years or 10 years to actually use climate finance for your emission reduction activity. And after that, it should be redeployed to something new and something else. Because the notion is there's never going to be enough climate finance. So it needs to be redeployed to the priorities in each commitment period. All of that comes under a global stock take. This is a big event in Dubai, the first global stock take. The data is already clear. Houston, we have a problem. NDCs are not aligned. So there's going to be a big process now to get everyone to tighten up their NDCs. But this is something that we, as people involved in the climate space, need to be watching very carefully and banging the drums. Every 5 years, we need to see tightened NDCs. And those tightened NDCs need to be consistent with the science. And those NDCs that are consistent with the science are going to get climate finance. Those NDCs that are not consistent with the science will not until they start tightening up. It's going to be a competitive process. If you're an investor, you want to look for NDCs that are science aligned because you know that those ITMOs are going to be valid and that finance will follow. If you're looking at those countries that are sort of faking it and hoping to make it, you're going to realize that it's going to be very hard to attract capital for those NDCs, and that's the way it should be. As I alluded to, baselines need to be updated, and the exception for the 5+5 is removals. Nature-based or technology. Paris Agreement does not differentiate. A removal is a removal. So for removal, there's capital intensity for technology-based removals at this point. So understanding that it's a new technology, that there's probably a long run rate, it was given a 15+15. Understanding that we need to keep nature-based stocks stable if we're going to keep 1.5 alive. The removals coming from nature are also 15+15 because they want developing countries to be keeping forests standing for 30 years. We need those forests as they are till 2050, otherwise 1.5 is impossible. So removals on both sides are given longer term trajectories. So with that, I'll pause. Do you have anything else you want to add? This was a lot of content early in the morning.
Yeah, I think